What if the epicness that we sometimes spend our entire lifetime searching for exists not in spite of the boulders, but thanks to the boulder version of you, that these boulders inspire you to become? Often, when we least expect it, life thrusts us into the role of the reluctant Shero or hero in our own story. How we respond in those moments can be the difference between thriving or just surviving. We believe that our story will be determined by how we dare to answer one burning question: how to choose to live. Join us as we explore the mindset shifts, innovative strategies, and captivating stories from my own life experience and those of my truly epic guests. So let's get this started. There are some moments in time that change our lives forever, that change who we are forever. And for me, that moment really culminated in February 19th, 2016, when the phone rang. And from that very first inhale, I knew, because it was my youngest daughter's friend calling me from Colombia, South America, saying, I don't know how to tell you this, but there's been a dreadful accident. This boulder that had been attached to the side of a mountain in Colombia, South America for millions of years chose that one moment when my youngest child was beneath it to break loose and fall. And when I got this call, Schuyler was in an ICU in Colombia, South America, with three heroic doctors doing their best to keep her alive long enough so that I could come down and say my final goodbyes. Every shred of medical precedent said that when someone has this level of injury, it is impossible to survive. So as I jumped on a plane with my other daughter, my son stayed here in the US. When I jumped on that plane, every expert expectation was that I would be returning home with just the body of my child. And as I sat there at 30,000 feet, I had to decide what I was going to make my own life mean, what I was going to make her life mean, and from this moment, how I would choose to live. And so what this crystallized for me is that I believe that it's not just in these moments of crisis when we're faced with this question. I believe that this how to choose to live question is the core question that we all have faced as a species, as humankind, hopefully emphasis on kind, for thousands and thousands of years. It goes back beyond the Stoics, beyond our earliest religions. How do we choose to live so that when we take that last breath, we can feel like the life that we have lived, however long, however short, has been worth living, and somehow we have made a positive impact on this beautiful, majestic planet. So, in my own case, I sat there on that plane, zooming to the place where I knew that my daughter was fighting for her life. And of course, I desperately was hoping for a miracle, whatever a miracle might look like for us. And I had this swirling of emotion and feeling of not enoughness. I wasn't enough to trigger a miracle for my child. I mean, how could I do something? How could I play a role? Right? It's not like I expected to be solely capable of triggering a miracle, because of course that goes beyond the scope, the capacity of a mere human being. But how could I play even the tiniest little role of opening up the realm of possibility for this even to occur? And so as I sat there engulfed in this negative storm of emotions, one emotion kept slapping me across the face. And it was that feeling of distress at feeling so powerless to help my daughter. And as I wrestled with that, as I wrestled with all these questions that were swirling in my head, I landed in one place and I realized that this may be the first literal boulder that had dropped into our lives. But my life so far, I mean, I was in my mid 50s at the time. My life had been filled with frickin' boulders. I'd been in an abusive relationship. I'd been a single mom practically all of my life. I've been an entrepreneur multiple times over. So I'd had the exhilaration, the victory of being an entrepreneur. I'd also had the crushing defeat of the time when things just go horrifically wrong. And yet, the magic behind those other boulders is that they hadn't really crushed me, although at the time, sometimes it felt like they had. They had crushed the things that inadvertently I was allowing to make me play so small. And so now, where that had left me. And I never would have been able to tell you that this was where I was because I promise you, as I sat on that plane, I I felt so engulfed with self-doubt. And I knew I had to find this epic version of myself, but I didn't even know if this epic version of myself even existed. But what I did know is that if it was possible to find this version, to nurture this version, to pull this version magically out of thin air, my child was worth it. I had to go for it. So I realized that all those other boulders had inspired me to really immerse myself. And actually, even before those boulders, going back to my late teenage years when I had been fascinated with seeing how some human beings would face these insurmountable boulders in their life. And rather than being crushed, these particular people would emerge as this bigger, bolder version of themselves. And I noticed that every single time, it wasn't that they had some extraordinary level of luck or some magical something out in the world. They didn't have a tool that someone else didn't have. They certainly didn't have a magic wand. But what they did have was a powerful inner game every single time. And so, what I came to understand is that this inner game is so much bigger than simply the question of having a positive mindset or looking on the bright side. It was our focus, it was our energy, it was even our language, our choice of words, and perhaps most importantly, our our ability to envision. And what I mean by that is our ability to use our imagination, not the way we typically use it once we're adults, to worry, to fear, to self-doubt, but to use it to go beyond the hurdles of the current obstacles that were in place and to give us almost this superhero capacity so that these challenges, rather than being our kryptonite, they became our superpowers and drew from within us powers that sometimes we didn't even imagine that could be possible. And so as I sat there on that plane, I realized that I may not be able to do anything to change the outer game. I certainly couldn't roll back the wheels of time and undo that boulder. I definitely couldn't get in there and physically help my daughter. But what I could do now at this point was I could invest in this inner game stuff that I had read about, that I'd learned about, that I'd studied. It was a different kind of magic, but it was all that I felt that I really had. So I was about to find out it either worked or it didn't. It was either real and obtainable, or it was just kind of a cool story. But I was about to play this inner game like I'd never played it before. I was investing in this inner game to win. That was how I was going to show up choosing to live. And so, what that meant is that, again, I had to pay attention to those three things. What was I going to focus on? Was I going to focus on the presence of what I wanted, meaning Schuyler, vibrant, achieving her miracle, whatever, being fine, whatever the new fine was destined to be, even if that meant that physically Schuyler didn't make it, her legacy could carry on. No one could ever take the synergy that had been created from those 22 years that we had lived together. I could step forward, not as the mother of a child who'd been tragically killed by a boulder, but as the mother of a child who, in just 22 years, was able to make more of a positive impact, a powerful impact on this planet than many of us make in 80. So that I could do. And I could focus on the language, not just what I was expressing to others, but the language within my own mind, my own inner narrative, rather than focusing on the presence of the challenge, focus on the possibility of opportunity of these miracles. So that meant I had to ask myself some new questions. I had to get my place so that my mind could believe that the impossible could actually transform into the I'm possible. So what it looked like at the moment was sitting there on that plane and starting really small. In fact, not even starting with our own story, because my mind was having a tough time believing that, especially based on what the experts were telling me. No, I had to start with other people's story. That was my way into the gate. So the gentlest question that my mind could perhaps buy into was, has anyone else ever experienced something, created something, done something that everyone else, in fact, all evidence said was impossible? Well, sitting on a plane barreling through the sky at 30,000 feet, that question was almost laughable because clearly, again, when the Wright brothers or whoever actually invented the plane, if they didn't, but I think the reputation is that they did, you can imagine that they were literally crashing and burning. And you can imagine what the people were saying around them. They thought probably that they'd lost their mind. And there's so many examples throughout history of people achieving things, proving things, living things, experiencing things, manifesting things that everyone else until that point said it could not be done. So there was this little shred of it's possible, right? And then from there, I had to take it to, well, is it physically possible? Has anyone ever seen a physical miracle? And of course, if you look at Hollywood and all sorts of stories, the world is laden with people who physically overcame the impossible. So there I was in a place where I could believe that not only could this be possible, but based on a lot of evidence, it was reasonable to actually expect that if them, why not us? It might even be probable that this could happen. And so I was able to find the thoughts that inched my way from doubt to a little bit of hope, and from hope to a little bit of belief, but even belief has a crack in it. So I had to keep going. I had to find, based on what I was feeling, how does this one inner narrative statement make me feel? And I had to protect that. I I I had to protect the thoughts within my own mind and quarantine them the way that I would protect my external technology if something invaded that technology that would not let my technology perform at its highest level. So in this case, only thoughts that fueled this vision that a miracle could be probable, those were the only thoughts that were allowed in until finally I was able to get to this place that felt like this incredible knowing that everything would be fine, whatever the new fine was destined to be. To some people, you might call that faith, but it was a feeling that really kind of dissolved the sense that I have to fight. Because think about it, if what you focus on expands and you're fighting, that fuels the adversary because you're not really trying to look on the bright side, are you? When you're trying to look on the bright side, where is your focus? Really, it's on this big looming dark side. You just don't want to look at it. So getting to the place of a knowing had to be this place of consummate joy, even though theoretically it was counterintuitive to believe that the mother of a child who was fighting for her life and facing what other people said was probable death could possibly find a way to feel joy. And yet, that was how I knew that I had to weave this crazy path in order to help her. So when I arrived after being turned away in Tampa at the airport originally by American Airlines, saying we were too close to take off. We were 45 minutes before the plane that we needed to fly us to Miami to connect with the flight to Colombia. We were 45 minutes, and even though we weren't checking any luggage, um, their policy was nope, we couldn't get on board. And even though they knew the circumstances, literally someone at the desk said, that is not my problem. So we drove to Miami. We got on a plane. We flew to Bogota. We waited in Bogota. We got another plane that flew us to Bucaramanga. And from Bucaramanga, the rafting company that had been there with Schuyler when that boulder fell drove us the 4 hours to this tiny little hospital in this place that I'd never heard of called Socorro, Colombia. And when we walked in, my oldest daughter and I, there was no weeping, hysterical mother. I was there to lead Team Schuyler toward anything that could vaguely resemble our miracle. And I won't kid you, the miracles began from that very first moment. This uncanny string of, you can call them coincidences, synchronicities, from the fact that one of the medical team, one of the doctors that was working on Schuyler, just happened to be the retired head of neurosurgery from the University of Bogota. He happened to retire in this tiny little town that happened to have an ICU, because in Colombia, ICUs are privately run, so very few hospitals have them. So he happened to be there. They happened to share, because there's no HIPAA in Colombia, they happened to share Schuyler's x-rays with this neurosurgery big worldwide conference that happened to be going on at the time, someone advised them from the US that actually the prudent thing to do, because of all the swelling, because of the damage, the boulder landed was a direct hit right in the middle of her eye. So it cracked open her skull. It actually also crushed her lungs, fractured her spine, fractured both scapula, snapped her right thigh, and pulverized her left ankle. So there were at least four injuries that I was later told people typically never survived from. But this particular brain injury that was causing the swelling, these neurosurgeons in Colombia and Socorro were advised to actually really, uh, to my understanding, not being a medical professional, but the equivalent of kind of taking out part of her brain, which would have irreparably changed her. There's no coming back from that. And something made them decide we're not going to take that path, even though this was a world-renowned neurosurgeon advising this. And by the time we got there, which was about 24 hours after the boulder had fallen, they were already starting to see a little bit of encouraging progress. And by the time we got to the hospital the following morning, the three doctors were astonished. They, even though they spoke Spanish, I don't speak Spanish, but through Schuyler's friend and through this amazing woman, Amelita, who's become like a sister to me, who is helping to translate, they showed us a picture on the phone of a CAT scan of Schuyler that showed the swelling had come down at a level that you might have expected a week or two down the line, not 48 hours later. So one thing led to another. And within 3 days, we were able to actually fly Schuyler from Colombia. An air ambulance came from Fort Lauderdale. This amazing team came and came to again Bucaramanga. So we had to make that unbelievable ambulance ride for 4 hours back to rendezvous with them, where there was no doctor in the ambulance. There was limited oxygen. Had for any reason we run out, we would have Schuyler would have been sunk. Plus, during the entire ride, if you're not familiar with Colombia, the mountains are incredibly high and they're incredibly switchback. So literally, without exaggerating, we literally had to stop every 20 minutes, pull over for the ambulance to pull her back because her head was banging against the front of the ambulance. Now, remember, she had a fractured spine. So the fact that it didn't nick her spinal cord was unbelievable at this point, and yet it didn't. And so we arrived at Bucaramanga Airport, this huge production, about 45 minutes on the tarmac to actually take all the gear from Colombia off of her, with just a couple of exceptions, put new gear from the US, try to communicate what they had the Colombian team had been giving Schuyler. Again, there was no doctor, so the ambulance team was really struggling to tell the American team, well, this is what she has, what she needs. There was a huge, even at that point, a huge stack of medical records, impossible to look at in a matter of minutes. And so they got Schuyler up onto this tiny little plane, this like executive plane that had been transformed, and we began our journey to Miami. And when we arrived in Miami, it was an amazing experience because, again, the look, now we were dealing with like the Olympians of neurosurgery. And I vividly remember meeting them the first time when they came in. This particular team happened to be all men, different ages. There was an evening team that was led by a couple of powerhouse women. This was the men. And I will always remember the look on their face when they walked into the tiny room where now Sky is on one of those beds that kind of was rocked back and forth to make sure there was no pressure on that spinal cord. As they were assessing her scenario, they would not make eye contact. The concern, the hopelessness in the room was palpable. And this was the moment that, again, I was inspired to lean into everything I knew about the inner game and to really stop them at one point and say, look, you are the best of the best. This hospital, this was Jackson Memorial, that was known around the world for their ability to handle trauma. You are the best of the best. The equipment here is the best of the best. The medical profession is the best of the best. My daughter is going to be fine. We just have to figure out how to get her there. And as those words came forth, as that energy infused toward them, you could feel them, the stress kind of roll off and them regaining their sense of their own power and who they were capable of showing up being. And from that moment, the miracles just continued, miracle after miracle after miracle. And throughout this podcast, I'll share a bit more of some of these incidents along the way. But to cut to the question that you're probably asking yourself, what happened to Schuyler? On May 10th, 2016, Schuyler was officially released from the hospital. She had officially survived the unsurvivable, and I became her 24/7 caregiver.
Okay, this is Schuyler's first trip out since February 19th. Yay! Okay, I want to go out first. We'll go out the far door, and that way I can capture this little face. We'll go out here. Sorry.
Because as you can see, if you're watching this on YouTube, but if you're not, surviving the unsurvivable didn't mean that she was back the way it was before. It meant that she simply was alive. And now we had a new journey forward, a completely new journey forward. And now we would once again be faced with that question of how to choose to live. Because at this moment, my business at the time had been all but destroyed because my business was seasonal. And newsflash, it's almost impossible to make a cold sales call from an ICU. And Schuyler, at this point, could not walk, could not stand up. The boulder had completely compromised her sense of balance and her coordination. Now she had ataxia. It had damaged, they thought initially she would be blind. That was another miracle. She could see, but she had no peripheral vision. She had double vision, and one eyelid remained half closed. And so this is a child who could not lift her arm. She could barely swallow. She could barely speak. It was too dangerous because of her balance for her to be left alone in the room. So now, at the age of 56 years old, I had to figure out once again how to choose to live. How was I going to go forward and pay the bills and be the caregiver mom that my daughter desperately needed me to be, and what future lay ahead for us. So it was an incredibly difficult time. It felt like this dark abyss until one morning when I was just waking up and I was staring at this mountain of bills. And it struck me that if I had been able to play the inner game to win during this medical miracle, could I possibly use it to be open enough now to shift it toward things on the outer game, i.e., my business and my purpose. So one thing had led to another in order to rally the global team, our global family. I had been posting on Facebook things to not to, oh my gosh, please pray for my daughter. She's in danger of dying. It was no, if you want to cheer for us, then you go out, you live your dreams, you be that epic version of yourself. And as it turned out, people who didn't even know us began stumbling upon this. They began sharing it until finally people started kind of even recognizing us. And one of those fans stopped me one day and said, "When are you going to turn that into a book?" And that is how my first book, The Sky is the Limit, came to pass. It is actually those identical unedited posts from those first 4 months. And as a result of that, people started asking me to speak and ultimately started asking me for the framework. Could I coach that inner game that was different than just having a positive mindset or your typical stuff that you might see as a life coach, right? Coping skills. This wasn't this at all. This went much deeper. And at first I really pushed back saying, "Hey, that's not who I am. That's not what I trained to be." But I didn't train to be a caregiver either. And so at first I pushed back. But then as I started hearing the stories of how these words had impacted people, I realized that our story had not come to pass for all the doubters, for all the cynics who, for all the people who might question my motive of sharing this story. No, I was not put on this planet for the benefit of subject matter content for the haters out there. I was there for the people, the maybe even the one person who by intersecting with our story might unleash that epic version of themselves and their own story. So from that moment, I started to be open. I ended up at an event that changed my life. Thanks to my friend, my sister Amelita, she pushed me to attend it. And as you'll hear in episode 2 of this, it was again serendipitous what happened at that event. And that shifted my questions, the question that I was asking myself. I began to ask myself, well, what if? Could I? And I began to dive into the could this be? Could this be this epicness that I've searched my entire lifetime for? So, why have I created this podcast? I've created this podcast to help you because, like I said, I believe that this one question is at the root of every single thing that we do as human beings, and that probably we have done the motivating factor for thousands and thousands of years. It's how to choose to live. And what I discovered that one of the most foolish things that we can do is believe that we're supposed to answer that question on our own. We are here with those questions, I believe, so that we get incredibly frustrated and open ourselves to collaborating with the wisdom and the experience of others. And through that collaboration, we blossom. We discover this epic version of ourselves that maybe we never even dreamed could possibly have existed. It's through that messy, perfectly imperfect story that we weave that we achieve these incredible heights. And so I've decided, after having coached now hundreds and hundreds of amazing souls and considering myself to be in the business of helping people whether they be entrepreneurs, individuals, none of the above, and or entire teams to come even more alive. My mission is to help you discover that differentiating factor within yourself, to release the bias that makes you feel that you have to go it alone, that makes you say, I'm not ready to ask for help. I'm weak if I ask for help, to help you go out there and be that biggest, boldest version, that most exquisite version of yourself possible. So what you will see here as we go forward, yes, you'll see a few more little bird's eye view of my own story and of Schuyler's story, but you'll also see the incredible wisdom that is out there from the people around us. And I would encourage you to reach out to some of them. They make incredible mentors. As you will see, some of them were some of my original mentors. We are here to grow, to learn, to never stop learning. That I believe that we succeed not in spite of the boulders, but thanks to the the heights that these boulders allow us to achieve. It's the duality, the moments that are so incredible that they take our breath away. But the real growth tends to come in the moments that are so painful that they knock the wind out of us. And that is when we go questing. So I encourage you, have fun with this. Listen to this. Ask yourself some new questions. At the end of each episode, I will give you a special little sort of tip, a little mission, something to ponder in your day. And I would encourage you always reach out to me when you know that you are ready. If I can help you, I I I invite you with open arms. If any of my guests can help you, take advantage of that. But go out and explore what it means to be deliciously alive in this story where you are the hero or the Shero of the story. So I am Meredith Alexander. I am CEO of Grit Mindset Academy, and I am thrilled to be your host for this How to Choose to Live podcast. Now, let's have some fun going forward and go out there and create something epic. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the How to Choose to Live podcast. Today's tip is all about your focus. And the big question here is, what are you focusing on?
So here's a moment when I think you're going to say, uh-oh, busted, right? Because this was me too. Have you ever heard this saying that what you focus on expands, and you're sitting there staring at your bank account going, why are you not expanding, right? Well, what I learned is that most of the time when we think we're focusing on what we want, we are actually focusing on the lack of the presence of what we want. Who knew? So when I'm there going, oh my gosh, a year from now, I want to be making 7 figures. I want to be making 8 figures. I want to live in this beautiful house surrounded by people that I absolutely adore, not that toxic person over there. I'm actually usually focusing on the presence of what's missing. So are you busted? If you are, start focusing on what you do want, not the checklist of what's missing.
So today's mission is to step out into the world very deliberately and consciously, focusing on the presence of what you want. And here's another little hint. You'll know when you're getting this right by how you feel. When you feel that excitement, it's like playing the hot and cold game, and you know that you're getting warm. When you feel the crunch, it probably means that you are focusing on what you don't want. In other words, the lack of the presence of what you want. So go out there and choose to live deliciously and powerfully and go out and do something epic. See you next time.